Rain hammered against the porch roof, the night my husband handed me a garbage bag instead of an umbrella. 22 years of marriage, and Marcus stood in the doorway of the house I had scrubbed, painted, and prayed in, looking at me the way you'd look at a stranger who had overstayed a visit. His mother's ashes weren't even cold in the ground yet. "I only needed you to take care of my mother," he said, calm as a man reading a grocery list. I waited for him to laugh, to say it was a bad joke. He didn't. He told me to pack. He told me not to expect anything. I want to tell you how I ended up standing on my own front steps with a suitcase and no coat, because it didn't happen in one night. It happened over 3 years, one small erosion at a time, the way a riverbank disappears without anyone noticing until the house built on it starts to lean. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 46 years old, and until 3 years ago, I taught third grade at Willow Creek Elementary. I loved that job with the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything back. The smell of pencil shavings, 26 kids reciting the alphabet off-key. The way a shy child's face would open up like a window when they finally understood long division. I gave it up the year Margaret, my mother-in-law, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Marcus said his mother needed someone she trusted, someone patient, someone who wouldn't put her in a home like she was furniture nobody wanted anymore. He said it would be temporary. He said we'd hire help eventually. Eventually never came. So I left my classroom, my grade book still half filled with November's spelling scores, and I became a full-time caregiver. I learned how to cut Margaret's food into small pieces so she wouldn't choke. I learned the rhythm of her physical therapy exercises, the exact volume of voice that didn't startle her, the old songs that could pull her back from wherever her mind had wandered. There were days she called me by her sister's name, a woman who'd been dead for 30 years. There were days she didn't recognize her own son's face, but she always knew mine. Even in her worst hours, some part of her recognized me as someone safe. Marcus, meanwhile, climbed. He was a sales director for a medical equipment company, the kind of man who measured his worth in quarterly numbers and steakhouse dinners with executives. Our neighbors thought he was a saint for keeping his mother out of a nursing home. They had no idea I was the one who hadn't slept a full night in 3 years. They had no idea I hadn't seen a movie in a theater, hadn't gone to dinner with a friend, hadn't bought myself a new coat. Because every spare dollar and every spare hour belonged to a woman who wasn't even my own mother. I didn't resent Margaret. I loved her in the strange, quiet way you love someone you've nursed through their worst days. What I resented, what I didn't even let myself name as resentment for a long time, was Marcus's absence. Not just physical, though there was plenty of that. Something colder. A husband who stopped asking how I was doing because he'd already decided the answer didn't matter. I never asked him directly what was wrong between us. I told myself it wasn't the right time, that Margaret needed stability, that I couldn't blow up our home while she was still alive and needed both of us, even though both of us had quietly become just me. Looking back now, I think some small part of me already knew how this would end. I just didn't expect the shoe to drop the same week we buried his mother, but that's exactly what happened. And that brings us back to the porch, the rain, the garbage bag instead of an umbrella, the words that ended 22 years in 11 seconds. I stood there in the downpour, soaked through before I even reached the sidewalk. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't beg him to reconsider. I just picked up my suitcase and walked, because some part of me that had been quietly gathering evidence for 3 years already knew I wasn't losing a home that night. I was finally leaving one I'd never really had. My phone buzzed as I reached the end of the driveway, a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Claire, don't leave town. Margaret left something only for you." 3 weeks before Margaret died, she had one of those rare mornings where the fog lifted almost completely. I was reading to her from an old paperback when she reached over and put her hand on mine. Her grip was thin but steady. "Claire," she said, and there was nothing hazy in the way she said my name. "Promise me something." I told her anything. "Promise me you'll never let Marcus decide your worth." I laughed it off gently, the way you do with someone whose mind drifts in and out. She squeezed my hand harder. "I mean it. I've watched him treat you like hired help for 3 years and I won't say it again. So listen now. Don't let him decide what you're worth." Then, as quickly as the clarity had come, it slipped away. Within the hour, she was asking if I'd fed the chickens on a farm that hadn't existed in 60 years. I filed it away as one of Margaret's lucid moments, touching, but confusing. I had no idea she'd spent the 2 years prior sitting across a desk from an attorney named Elaine Foster, quietly rewriting the entire architecture of her estate in complete secrecy. But what happened next would completely change everything I thought I understood about that final year. During those last weeks, Marcus grew more distant than I'd ever known him to be. His phone, which used to sit face down on the counter, started staying in his jacket pocket, buzzing against his chest at dinner. At which point he'd excuse himself to the garage to take a work call. I noticed a name on his lock screen more than once: Danielle Cross, a colleague from his office. Someone who always smiled at me a beat too long, like she was calculating something. I noticed, and I said nothing. I told myself I was too tired to fight, too consumed with turning Margaret every 2 hours so she wouldn't develop bed sores. Some women would call that weakness. I call it survival triage. You can only carry so much weight before you have to set something down, and I chose to set down my suspicion so I could carry Margaret instead. She passed on a Tuesday morning in early spring. The window cracked open because she'd always loved the smell of rain. My hand wrapped around hers, exactly the way it had been for 3 years of mornings. She didn't struggle. Her breathing simply slowed, then stopped, like a tide going out for the last time. I sat with her for almost 20 minutes before I called anyone. When Marcus finally arrived 45 minutes later, still smelling faintly of a restaurant I didn't recognize, he stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his mother's body with an expression I can only describe as inconvenienced. No tears, just a long exhale, like a man relieved of a scheduling conflict. I told myself grief looks different on everyone. But something in me filed that moment away too, next to the phone buzzing against his chest, next to Margaret's hand gripping mine with a strength that shouldn't still have been in her. The funeral was small and dignified, exactly what Margaret would have wanted. Marcus gave a short, polished eulogy that sounded like it had been written by someone who'd read about grief rather than felt it. I stood at the graveside feeling strangely calm, the calm of a woman who has already cried every tear she has in private, alone at 2 in the morning, over 3 long years. It was only after the last guest left, after Marcus had gone inside to pour himself a drink, that my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. "Mrs. Bennett," the woman on the other end said, her voice measured. "My name is Elaine Foster. I was your mother-in-law's attorney. She instructed me very specifically to wait exactly 7 days after her funeral before contacting you." A pause, papers shifting. "There are things you need to know, Claire. Things Margaret made sure of long before she got sick. I'll call you again in 7 days." The line went dead before I could ask a single question. If I had known what was coming, I might have braced myself differently. But those 7 days passed like a held breath, and I didn't tell Marcus a word of it. On the 7th day, I finally worked up the courage to tell Marcus I wanted to go back to teaching. I brought it up over dinner, tentatively, the way you test ice before putting your full weight on it. Willow Creek had an opening for the fall. My old principal had actually reached out when she heard about Margaret. Marcus set down his fork. "Teaching," he repeated, like the word tasted bad. He said I'd been out of the classroom for 3 years. that I'd be lucky if they let me grade papers, let alone run a room full of 8-year-olds. He said it with a small, condescending laugh I'd heard more times over the years than I wanted to admit. I told him I wanted to try anyway. That's when I watched 22 years of carefully maintained politeness drain out of his face all at once. "You want to try," he said. "Claire, I only needed you to take care of my mother." He kept going, his voice rising with something that had clearly been building for a long time. He said he'd tolerated 3 years of a marriage that had stopped meaning anything to him, that he couldn't afford professional care without touching his savings, that this was the only reason he hadn't already asked for a divorce. "Now she's gone," he said. "So are you." He reached into his pocket, pulled out the spare house key I'd given him years ago, and set it on the table between us like a period at the end of a sentence. Then he stood, walked to the front door, and opened it. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a bruise. I packed a single suitcase. I didn't even take half of what was mine. I walked past him without a word, and he didn't stop me. He just watched, arms crossed, as I stepped into the storm with my life reduced to one bag and no umbrella. I checked into a motel 3 blocks away, one I'd driven past 100 times without ever really seeing it. I sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, and finally let myself feel the weight of what had happened. Not devastation exactly, something closer to grim clarity, like fog finally burning off a landscape I'd been driving through blind. My phone rang once that night. Elaine Foster's name lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail. Whatever she had to tell me, it could wait one more night. Back at the house, Marcus poured himself a scotch and called Danielle before he'd even finished his first glass. "It's done," he told her, his voice loose and satisfied. "I'm finally free." He told her he could see them building something real now. The house was his, the future was his, and nothing was standing in his way anymore. He had no idea, sitting there with his drink and his certainty, exactly how wrong he was. At 8:30 that evening, Marcus pulled his car into the driveway of the home he believed was entirely his. But as his headlights swept across the front of the house, he saw something that made him ease his foot off the brake. 2 black SUVs were already parked at the curb, waiting. He stepped out slowly, gravel crunching under his shoes. A man in a dark suit stepped forward, polite but immovable, and asked him to wait a moment. Marcus's confusion tightened into irritation, the particular irritation of a man used to giving instructions, not receiving them. "This is my house," he said. "Who exactly are you people?" That's when Elaine Foster stepped out of the second vehicle, a slim leather folder tucked under one arm. She introduced herself and explained she was here to formally execute the terms of Margaret's estate. Marcus scoffed. He said he already knew the terms, he'd seen the will years ago. The house was his, same as it had always been meant to be. Elaine opened the folder and, without any particular drama, explained that the will he was thinking of had been superseded 2 years earlier by a revocable living trust, one Margaret had established quietly, with full legal capacity. Well before her diagnosis progressed to the point where her competency could be questioned. Under the terms of that trust, the house had never belonged to Marcus at all. It had remained solely in Margaret's name until her death, at which point ownership would transfer entirely to whoever had served as her full-time primary caregiver. Marcus laughed, a short, disbelieving bark. He said no court would uphold something like that. Elaine turned a page and read the relevant clause aloud, her voice even and precise. The caregiver was named specifically, Claire Ann Bennett. I felt some surge of vindication hearing about this later, watching my husband's certainty crumble in his own driveway. But when Elaine told me the story afterward over coffee, what I actually felt was something quieter and heavier. The realization that Margaret had spent her last lucid years quietly building me a lifeboat. because she knew long before I let myself admit it exactly what her son was capable of. According to a neighbor who watched the whole thing from her window, Marcus's voice rose in the driveway that night. He said it was insane, that he'd contest it, that no piece of paper was taking his childhood home away from him. Elaine, still perfectly composed, told him that contesting a properly executed trust, with documented medical evaluations confirming Margaret's competency at the time of signing, would be an extremely uphill, extremely expensive battle. Then she handed him a formal notice. He had 48 hours to vacate. I arrived at the house the next morning at Elaine's request, still wearing yesterday's clothes. Marcus was standing in the front hallway, surrounded by half-filled boxes, his face a mixture of fury and something raw underneath it, something that almost looked like fear. "You planned this," he said, his voice cracking. "You and my mother behind my back for years." I stood in the doorway of the house I'd scrubbed and painted and grieved in, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the urge to shrink, to apologize, to smooth things over. "No," I said, "your mother did." He didn't have anything to say to that. Moving back into the house didn't feel the way I expected. I thought there'd be some triumphant sense of reclaiming what was mine. Instead, every room felt haunted by a version of my life I was trying to leave behind. I gave myself 2 weeks to sit with all of it. Then I called Willow Creek Elementary. My old principal, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Susan, didn't hesitate. The third-grade position was still open. 3 weeks later, I stood in front of a classroom full of 8-year-olds again, chalk dust on my sleeve, and felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in years. It was through the school that I met Nathan Price. His daughter Lily was in my class, a bright, quiet girl. Turns out her father was an architect, the kind of thing I used to joke about in report card comments. Nathan was a widower, his wife having passed from cancer 3 years earlier. And there was something about the way he carried himself that I recognized instantly, a particular tiredness that comes from holding a household together alone. Our friendship started slowly, the way real things tend to. He came by one Saturday to fix a section of fence that had come loose in a storm. He didn't make it a big gesture, just showed up with a toolbox, fixed it, and left before I could properly thank him. A few weeks later, he replaced a porch light that had been out since before Margaret died. When I caught a bad cold that winter, he left a pot of soup on my doorstep with a note that just said, "Feel better." No reply needed. I stood in my kitchen with that note in my hand, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not romance, not yet. Just the strange, quiet relief of being looked after by someone who expected nothing in return. Marcus, meanwhile, had moved into a small apartment across town, beige walls, a view of a parking lot. He tried at first to maintain the same image he always had, successful and unbothered. But Danielle, it turned out, had never been interested in Marcus himself. She'd been interested in the version of him that came with a paid-off house and an executive salary. The moment word got out that he'd lost the house, her interest evaporated with startling speed. Within 2 months, she transferred to a different branch entirely. And Marcus was left alone in his beige apartment, with nothing to show for the freedom he'd been so eager to celebrate that rainy night. I heard through the grapevine that he'd started drinking more, grown quieter at work. I felt something when I heard that, but it wasn't satisfaction. It was more like the particular sadness of watching someone finally reckon, alone and too late, with a truth he'd spent years avoiding. My life, meanwhile, kept quietly rebuilding itself. I slept through the night again. I laughed at things without feeling guilty for enjoying myself. Nathan and I began having coffee after school pickups, nothing formal, just two tired adults comparing notes on their strange, upended lives. He never pushed. He never made me feel like I owed him anything for his kindness, which after 22 years of a marriage built on obligation, felt like its own kind of miracle. It was almost 5 months after that rainy night on the porch, when my phone rang and Marcus's name appeared for the first time since the driveway. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered, stripped of its usual polish. "Claire," he said, "can we talk? We met at a small diner halfway between our two lives." Marcus looked different, thinner, grayer at the temples, his collar slightly wrinkled. He'd always ironed his own shirts before important conversations. That small detail told me more than anything he was about to say. He started with an apology, the kind that comes out in a rush after months of rehearsing it alone. Pressure, work, his mother's illness, money worries he'd never told me about. Grief had made him cruel in ways he didn't recognize until it was too late. I let him finish. I didn't soften my expression to make it easier for him. When he was done, I asked the only question that actually mattered anymore. "When exactly did you stop loving me?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He stared down at his coffee like the answer might be written in the steam. He tried a few times to start a sentence and abandoned each one halfway through. Watching him struggle, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself accept before. It wasn't that he'd stopped loving me at some identifiable point I could grieve properly. It was that he'd never really known how, not in the daily, unglamorous, unrewarded way love actually requires. He'd loved the idea of a devoted wife, the way he loved his job title, as something that reflected well on him. Nathan arrived a few minutes later, right on schedule. We'd planned to meet for a movie that evening. He didn't come inside. He simply waited by his car in the lot, visible through the diner window, patient in the way that had become so familiar to me. Marcus saw him. I watched something shift across his face, not jealousy exactly, something closer to a slow, sinking recognition. For the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to be the one standing outside, waiting for someone who had already moved on without him. "Is there any chance we could try again?" he asked quietly. "Start over, I've changed. Losing everything taught me things I should have learned decades ago." I believed in that moment he might even mean it. But meaning something and having earned the right to ask for it are two very different things, and I'd spent enough of my life confusing the two. "I already spent 22 years proving my love," I told him, gathering my coat. "I'm not spending another 22 proving my value." He didn't argue. I think some part of him had expected exactly that answer, even if he'd hoped for a different one. I left him there staring at his cooling coffee and walked out to where Nathan was waiting. He didn't ask what happened. He just opened the car door the way he always did and let the silence between us be comfortable instead of demanding an explanation. 3 days later, my phone rang again. Elaine Foster, not Marcus. Her voice was gentler than I'd heard before. There was one more piece of Margaret's affairs to settle. A sealed letter left specifically for me, with instructions it only be delivered once the estate matters were fully resolved. "She wanted you to read it when you were ready," Elaine said. "I think that time might be now." I read Margaret's letter alone at the kitchen table, in the late afternoon light of a Sunday that felt, in hindsight, like it had been chosen for me on purpose. Her handwriting inside was shakier than on the envelope, evidence of a hand fighting the disease even as she wrote. She said she'd known long before her diagnosis worsened exactly what kind of man her son had become. Watching him treat me the way he did over those years had broken something in her she never fully told anyone. She'd started planning the trust almost 2 years before she died, in one of her last stretches of full clarity. Because she knew Marcus would eventually show me exactly who he was once he no longer needed me for anything. Near the bottom, her handwriting grew smaller, more deliberate, like she'd wanted to get the words exactly right. You stopped being my daughter-in-law the day you became my daughter. I read that line 4 times before it fully landed. Then I put the letter down and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in years. Not the tight, controlled tears I'd rationed out during Margaret's illness. Not the numb stillness of the night Marcus threw me out. This was the particular release of finally being seen completely and understood by someone who had watched everything. The months that followed settled into something I hadn't realized I'd been missing for most of my adult life, an ordinary, unremarkable peace. I kept teaching. My classroom filled up again with the small chaos I'd missed. Nathan and I kept building what we'd started, slowly and honestly, without either of us needing the other to fill some desperate gap. Lily started calling me by my first name instead of Miss Claire, which felt, in its own small way, like being welcomed somewhere. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in my backyard, of all the unglamorous, perfect places, while we were cleaning up after a simple dinner with Lily. No elaborate speech, no restaurant reservation. He got down on one knee beside the garden Margaret used to love watching me tend from her window, and opened a small box holding a modest ring that had belonged to his late wife. It was Lily's own suggestion, he told me later, because she said her mother would have wanted someone kind to have it, and she thought I was the kindest person she knew. I said yes before he even finished the question. I ran into Marcus only once after that by accident, several months later. I was in the garden with Nathan on a Saturday afternoon, both of us laughing about something small and forgettable, when I noticed a car slow down on the street. It was Marcus's, older now, a little worse for wear, much like the man behind the wheel. He didn't get out, he didn't wave. He just sat there for a long moment, watching me laugh in a garden that used to be his, standing beside a man who looked at me the way he never had. Then, quietly, he drove away. I don't know what went through his mind in that moment, and I've stopped trying to guess. I only know that whatever he lost that day wasn't the house, and it wasn't even the marriage. It was the last chance to understand what it means to be loved by someone who stays, fully and without condition, long after it stops being convenient. I think about Margaret often, especially in quiet moments in the garden. I think about her hand gripping mine, telling me not to let anyone else decide my worth. I understand now she wasn't just comforting a tired caregiver in a lucid moment. She was handing me a truth she'd learned too late in her own life, trying to make sure I didn't learn it the same way. For 22 years, I thought love meant sacrifice, giving until there was nothing left and calling that devotion. It doesn't. Love is being valued while you're still there, not mourned or apologized to after you're already gone. I'd love to know what you think of this story and where in the world you're watching from tonight. What would you have done in my situation? Leave a comment below and let me know. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and share your thoughts in the comments. We've got so many more stories like this waiting to be told. See you in the next one.